Hi, I'm Bobby Peer with Tap Into, and I'm here with David Blowbaum and Eva Ade from Summit Prep. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Bobby.
You.
I want to start a conversation today about the SAT and ACT testing. There's been some rumors, some misconceptions, and I want to correct some myths as to how the colleges are using the test. And will these standardized tests be something of the past, or will they be continued during the decision process for these universities? So, can we start a discussion on this?
Yeah, sounds great.
Great.
Yeah.
So, where do we begin with these tests?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So um, there have been so many misconceptions lately about, you know, colleges going test optional and what does that mean? Um, so what we tell our families and what we've found to be true is that when colleges say something's optional, it's not optional typically. Or if you don't submit it, then you have to have something that takes its place. So just to simplify college admissions, about one third of your application is going to be your grades. About one third of the application is your SAT, ACT scores, and one third is everything else. So that's your essays, your recommendations, your extracurriculars, etc. So if you don't submit your SAT and ACT, you have to have something that's filling that gap. So yeah, maybe you have just absolutely stellar grades and just have amazing extracurriculars. Yeah, that actually might make up for the whole of not having SAT and ACT scores. You'd have to have something to fill that gap, and it's risky. I mean, colleges know that these scores are actually important and they predict success in college. That's why Cornell, they went test optional for the class of 2020 admission cycle, and they just went test optional for this next class as well. But even in their press release, where they're saying that scores are optional, they're saying we still expect that many students will be able to take the test and will take the test, and we would like them to submit those scores because they reiterate that the scores are valuable. So if you have a school that's telling you these scores are valuable, they're telling you we want to see them. So all things being equal, if you're not submitting scores, you're at a disadvantage. Whereas if you are submitting scores, especially if they're good, that certainly gives you an advantage.
So, if a student does not test well,
Mhm.
or is that what this is all about? Is to alleviate that part of the equation? So all their grades from school are, say, they're a straight A student, but they don't test well. Um, is that why this rumor started? Do you think?
Great question. So what's difficult right now is that the average student in the country has an A minus average. So the average student isn't a student. So a lot of parents are very rightfully, justifiably shocked when their honor roll student gets a 20 on the ACT, especially in New Jersey. But what people don't know is a 20 is the average ACT score in the country. So if you are an A minus honor roll student, that's actually average. And so if you get the average ACT score, that's actually predicted. So there's usually, and the data backs this up, that there's usually not actually a huge gap um, in really academic attainment and academic preparation as we might think between SAT scores and ACT scores. So those students, by and large, who do really well on the tests, especially when it's paired with good grades, they're very likely to do well in college. Those students with those high grades but low SAT and ACT scores, when you actually look at the data, they usually underperform at colleges. So um, there are certainly students where there's a mismatch where truly they're going to be successful at Harvard, even if they get, a 28 on their ACT. But that's the exception, certainly, rather than the rule. More so, the SAT and ACT scores are an accurate predictor of how well a student will succeed. You want to be going to schools that you're going to be succeeding at, because that helps you succeed throughout life.
So what the part about it, kids not testing well, right? So I think that was so with what you're saying, David, the summary about I think the question was more, why do parents not like these exams? And I think you're saying that kids don't tend to do well, even though their grades show otherwise. But what about for kids that don't test well? I mean, I think that was the thing, is it that kids don't test well, or are you saying that kids generally don't do as well in the test? Like, so where would you really say that, like, I mean, not like anyone knows for sure, but where a lot of the maybe frustration is coming from? I could be wrong. I was looking for that in the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. So where's the frustration coming from? There's a lot of justifiable frustration, just about the circumstances in the world right now. But a ton of justifiable frustration about the college admissions process and how it's behind a closed door. There's really no transparency around that. That's always going to be anxiety provoking when you can't see how the decisions are made. So you have very little control over that. So that in of itself is always going to create stress over it. I think it also creates more stress and the feeling that these tests are unfair because there's such a mismatch between grades and SAT, ACT scores so often. Because you can have a straight A student who gets a 34 on the ACT, and you can have a straight A student who gets a 20 on the ACT. That doesn't actually mean that the ACT is not a good measure. It actually means that the grades weren't a good measure because everybody is just compressed into 50% of the country has an A. But we know that 50% of the country is not equal in educational attainment and educational preparation. So
it levels the playing field because you can't control all the schools in the United States and how they standardize their grading system. So the ACT and SATs is the way of, obviously I'm speaking.
Yeah.
That's why there's standardized tests.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, so many students would be disadvantaged without them. So if you think about a student in a rural area, they can have straight A's and be valedictorian of their class. Maybe it's a graduating class of 40 kids. A college does not care that they got straight A's and were valedictorian. And that student in a rural school probably couldn't take many, if any, APs, right? So what do they have to show that they're actually prepared to compete sometimes at the most difficult schools in the country? Without an SAT and ACT score, they have nothing to show that. No top school will ever look at them because that top school has no idea if they are actually prepared. If they can show an ACT score of 34, then every single college in the country is going to say, hey, they've demonstrated, even though they don't have APs, and even though we've never heard of this school before, we know from this national objective measure that this student is prepared to perform at this school. So
that makes a lot of sense. So when it comes to fairness and how the colleges are looking at this data, and is there any explanation as to the whys? I mean, as you had said, it's behind closed doors, and a lot of times it seems very random as to why did this school accept this student and not this one when the grades and the AP levels and all of that just were there for this particular student, but they didn't get in.
Right.
Is there an explanation?
There's a partial explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Which the partial explanation would be all that justifiable reason for frustration, right? So, let's take Harvard as an example. 1/3 of freshmen at Harvard, their parents went to Harvard. So 1/3 of all admitted students are legacy students. So if you have equal SAT score, if you have better SAT scores, you have better grades, but your parents didn't go to Harvard, you're probably not getting into Harvard. So how do you actually get into Harvard? Just using Harvard as an example, right? You have to be a recruited athlete, or your parents have to be a donor, or you have to be a legacy. There's a very, very small sliver of students who are going to get in just from academics and SAT, ACT scores. But obviously that's an anomaly because it's the most exclusive. But because it's the most exclusive, I think it shows all those inequities that go into what's from the outside seems like a totally arbitrary process. And even though it's not arbitrary for them, I would say it's an unfair process. I mean, demonstrated interest is one of the biggest criteria for being admitted to a school.
Demonstrated what?
Demonstrated interest. So, which to also just peel back the layers of the onion. What's driving the schools is their ranking. They all want to be ranked as high as possible. So what are the things that go into their ranking? Well, some of the things that go into their ranking are what percent of their students do they admit? So if they have 1,000 students apply and they let 1,000 students in, well, their admit rate is 100%. They're going to be at the absolute bottom of the rankings because of them. But Harvard, if they have 1,000 students apply and 10 get in, now they're at a 1% admit rate. That skyrockets their ranking because they admitted a small percentage of their applicants. That's one of the things that's driving test optional admissions, because they know that if we become test optional, more students are going to apply. Well, what happens when more students apply? They accept the same number of students they were going to anyway. So if you double the number of applicants but accept the same number, you shrunk your admit rate in half. So that's going to skyrocket you in the rankings. So that's one of the things driving test optional admissions. They're not trying to admit those students without test scores. They're trying to deny them to get their own rankings up. Right? So that's one thing that goes into it, just trying to deny more students to boost their own rankings. The other thing, now getting back to demonstrated interest and how that relates to a college's rankings, is yield rate. So yield rate means, let's say you give 1,000 students an offer letter. Okay, you're admitted. If 0 of those students then say, okay, now I accept, and I'm going to actually go to your school. If 0 students say that, you have a 0% yield rate. Shoots you down in the rankings.
Right.
What you want is that if you give 1,000 acceptance letters, you want all 1,000 of them to say yes to you, because then you have 100% yield rate. That's what the yield rate is. So what you want to do is you want to give as few acceptance letters to the students that you know will accept. So, how do you do that? You want to be as sure as possible. So how can you be as sure as possible? Well, if a student came to your campus, really engaged with the admissions office, and they do a lot of crazy stuff that you would not even think about. So when you're on their mailing list, they're tracking if you open your emails from them. And they're not just tracking, did you open their emails? They're tracking how quickly did you open their emails.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
They're tracking every time you log into this, the prospective student portal. Did you look around? Did you go on forums? So they're tracking all of that because they know that the most engaged students who demonstrate their interest, they know that those students are more likely to enroll if given an acceptance. And they care so much about that yield rate because it impacts their rankings. It's another thing that has driven early decision, right? So early decision, if they admit 100 students through early decision, 100 are going to accept that because it's binding. So you just guaranteed yourself 100% yield rate for all those early decision students. And I mean, there are schools where over 60% of the freshman class is filled just by early decision. And they're doing that, again, just to skyrocket their yield rate, to skyrocket their rankings. So
this is all how you put the colleges in tiers. Is this all colleges or the high tiered colleges, like the maybe 10% acceptance rate level schools? Or is it across the board?
It's all colleges. So all colleges do it to some degree. It's just, the more competitive the school, um, the more they're going to use those things because they can be choosier in who they accept. So, I mean, some schools, they have a 10% yield rate. So literally, if they send out 100 acceptances, only 10% of people are going to accept. So they're just going to accept everyone because I mean, a lot of schools are closing. So they're just trying to get bodies in the door. That's another reason for test optional, that they're going to accept everyone because their enrollment numbers are so down. But yeah, so the more competitive the school and the more the school is trying to rise in the rankings, the more they're going to try and game this. Even financial aid is so a lot of schools will say they're need blind for admissions.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is they might not say, well, and first of all, a lot of schools aren't. The default is they're not need blind. But even the schools that are need blind that say, just because your parents make $10,000 a year, we're not even going to consider that whether or not we're going to accept you or not. So fine, they don't. You get accepted regardless. But where it still plays a role with aid is how badly they want you to come.
Mm-hmm.
So they will. There's not a set amount that they're just going to say, this student has this need, so we're going to give them this much money. That's not how it works. How it works is this student has this amount of need. This is how much they want them. The school wants them. So this is the amount of money that we're going to give them. So that all plays a role in your test scores or their diversity numbers or their yield rate. They really want to boost their yield rate. If they know, we could give a $10,000 scholarship to this student and guarantee that they enroll, they're going to be more likely to do that. Whereas some other student, they might give $20,000 and not be sure the student will enroll. Well, they're not going to give the 20K then. So they want to use their $8 to boost their yield rate and their rankings as well. So there's so many.
And you need an education in the application process and decision process. Now, I know a topic of discussion also is the dropout rate. So if you were to advise a student of what school, I mean, they have those programs that you see at schools. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the program, but it tells you what your perfect school is. But everyone wants the higher level school. So how do you correct that with getting the right students at the right schools, regardless of grades and ACT, SAT scores? How can we correct that process?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's actually the most devastating thing about going to test optional is if you don't get those SAT, ACT scores, you lose a lot of that valuable information. And then you do see that students who didn't submit scores, they tend to get a lower GPA significantly, and they tend to have higher dropout rates. And what can be so devastating about that is that the average college dropout, well, not the average, 47% of college dropouts are in default on their student loans. So they still had to take out student loans for the time that they went. On average, the average dropout took out $14,000 in student loans. The average drop, and 47% of them can't even pay them at all. They're in default on them. So, you have the state of Texas, for instance, they have a 10% rule. So if you graduate in the top 10% of your class from any school, then you're guaranteed admittance into a public institution in Texas. Well, the issue with that is we know that those schools can vary in quality. So a top 10% at one of the difficult schools in the state is going to be a lot better prepared than a student who's in the top 10% of the class, but at one of the worst schools in the state. When you take one of those students who still excelled at that school, but through no fault of their own was not adequately prepared, and you put them at the University of Texas, Austin, and they were seeing 71% dropout rates from those students. That to me is appalling. I mean, you know that those students are going to underperform, like not just underperform, but likely drop out. So I think fit is so important so that one, the school can keep up its reputation and such, but way more important is the fit for the student so that they're going to a school that they can succeed in. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell has great data on this, that it's better to go to, so he took students who went to Harvard and some other school, and the students who excelled at Harvard were the most successful students across the board. But the students who got B's at Harvard were actually less successful than the students who got A's at an easier school. Even though these students who got A's at the easier school, they had lower SAT scores originally, but all those students from Harvard they could have become those A students at the easier schools. They had the grades, they had the SAT scores, but they chose to go to Harvard where they were B students, not A students. Those B students would have been more successful if they went to a worse school.
Wow.
So fit is incredibly important. Whatever school you go to, you want to be able to succeed at. That's what's best for the student. And that's also why I think SAT and ACT scores are so important as well, so that we make sure that we're getting a good fit that helps students.
I feel like we're just scratching the surface, and we could talk about this in so much more detail. But thank you very much for all of this information that's so valuable to the search process.